Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and it is a tremendous pleasure to welcome here this evening probably one of America's greatest living historians, Richard Pipes. Professor Pipes has been praised as a philosopher as much as a historian, not simply because his work that spans over half a century of research, study, and writing about Russia provides an accurate and comprehensive picture of events, individuals, motives, of men and women in their many historical roles, but because it draws the reader into a deeper reflection on the engines of history itself, the lures and dangers of ideology, the madness of systems run amok without understanding the simple truth that modern society, as Professor Pipes writes, can never be fully comprehended and therefore should not and cannot be fully controlled. Perhaps the ethos that has guided much of his work can be summed up in the observation he makes at the end of his concise history of the Russian Revolution, that political authority must never be employed for ideological ends. This is a sentiment and a conviction he has conveyed to generations of young scholars and general readers, and we are all in his debt for doing so. I had the great privilege and honor to publish several books by Professor Pipes at Yale University Press, and I well remember after the publication of The Unknown Lenin, which was based on what was called at the time the secret Lenin archive in Moscow, that a flood of criticism, largely from the Russian historical establishment, but also from certain sectors of American academia, erupted over the fact that the picture of Lenin that was produced by The Unknown Lenin was not, quote unquote, balanced. Lenin had written so much more than the often blood-curdling pronouncements that Professor Pipes had discovered in the secret Lenin archive in Moscow. Yes, Lenin did. He wrote much more, but he also wrote that. And as Professor Pipes put it at the time, the facts will stand by themselves. You can't give ground against them. You can't get around them. You cannot talk them away, and they cannot simply be balanced against other facts. It was only natural then that I would turn to Professor Pipes to inaugurate the series of lectures, conferences, and courses that will take place at YIVO over this next year and possibly 2 years to mark the event or set of events that forever changed European history, Jewish history, and the history of the world, by which I mean World War I and the Russian Revolution that followed. The dimensions of this massive phenomenon of world upheaval are still being investigated and explored in history, culture, and many other disciplines. For many, it changed time itself. In her May 22, 1918 diary entry, Empress Alexandra, who was then imprisoned by the Bolshevik government, the new Bolshevik government, notes that Lenin, quote, gave the order that the clocks had to have, that the clocks have to put, these are her words, she wrote in English, she was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, have to put 2 hours ahead, economy of electricity. So at 10, they told us it was 12. I'm not sure we yet know exactly what time it is, really. But I do know it's time for me to hand the podium over to Professor Pipes, who we are truly honored to have with us this evening.
Thank you, Jonathan Brent. As he mentioned, He did publish a number of my books for the Yale University Press, and I deeply appreciated that. Let me say that the subject of this lecture is, for me, not entirely academic. My father fought in World War I in the Polish legions. I was born 6 years after the Russian Revolution, and I suffered the consequences of World War I and the Russian Revolution, as I will describe in my talk. In September 1939, I was in Warsaw when the Germans attacked, and we spent days after day in basements eluding German bombs, Stuka bombs daytime and artillery bombs at night. So to me, the World War I and the Russian Revolution, which led to World War II and the Holocaust, are not academic subjects, but very, very much living subjects. And my wife, who escaped also from Poland during the war, has similar feelings about it. The subject is very important because the First World War and the Russian Revolution, which occurred during it, started a process that ended, among other things, in the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. So for Jews, this is a subject of immense importance because, as I'll point out in my talk, it led to a gigantic shift of population from Eastern Europe, where the majority of Jews used to live before World War I, to Israel and to the United States. In 1914, when World War I broke out, there were in the Russian Empire 5.5 million Jews. It was the largest number of Jews in any country had at the time in the world. By 1926, the number was down to 2.5 million. Today in Russia and the Ukraine at that time used to be part of Russia, it's difficult to estimate how many Jews there are, but between 250,000 and perhaps 550,000. So there's been an enormous drop. What used to be a focus of Jewish life in the world is now a sideshow. It's a massive shift, and Russia ceased to be the center of world Jewry. The number of Jews in Eastern Europe decreased similarly in Poland. There today in Poland, again, it's very difficult to get the exact number of people, but there's supposed to be between 12,000 and 30,000 Jews in Poland. When I lived there, as a boy, there were 3 million Jews. In the Czech Republic, it's estimated 4,000 Jews. And it's World War I and 1917 revolution that is largely responsible for these changes. Until the middle of the 18th century, there were no Jews in Russia, except because the church, the Orthodox Church, was very anti-Jewish, very anti-Semitic, and it did not want Jews in the Russian Empire. The other reason was that Russian merchants were afraid of Jewish competition. Later in the 19th century, for a reason I'll mention, when Jews finally appeared in Russia, they were outcompeted the Russian merchants, and they pleaded with Catherine the Great to keep them out. So the Jews first came to Russia as a result of the 3 partitions of Poland, 1772, 1793, and 1795, during which period Russia acquired some 800,000 Jews. Poland was an enormous center of Jewish life. Catherine the Great, who was empress at that time, and she carried out these partitions, wanted Jews to be given freedom and given equal rights. But again, on the one side the church, and on the other side the merchants were against it. And what was done was, in 1791, the Russians established what came to be known as the Pale of Settlement, the area where all Jews could live. It was the right bank Ukraine, Western Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. There Jews could live. Jews could live in Russia proper only if either they belonged to the upper guilds of merchants, in other words, were millionaires in effect, or had a higher education. So there were Jews in Russia, but very, very few. Basically, they lived in the Prelude settlement, and here they were allowed to farm, but basically they engaged in trade and textile manufacture, which means that in the eyes of the socialists, they were bourgeois, they were capitalists, which had very dire consequences when the Bolsheviks came to power. When World War I broke out in 1914, Jews were living in the midst of the zone of combat between Russia, Germany, and Austria, which led to all kinds of very bad consequences for them. There were 500,000 Jews approximately serving in the Russian army, but hardly any, if any, were officers. They only could serve as ordinary soldiers. In 1915, the Russians were very badly defeated by the Germans and the Austrians, and this had very bad consequences for the Jews because they were regarded by a large majority of Russians as sympathetic to the Germans. Now, there was some truth to that. It's difficult to imagine today that indeed, in the pre-Hitler period, most Jews were very favorably inclined towards Germany and Austria. Let me just give you a personal example. My father fled Poland, although he was born in the Ukraine, and went to Vienna and spent his teen years in Vienna. He mastered German language fully and taught me German when I was born in 1923. I spoke exclusively German until I was about 6 years old, and we moved to Warsaw, which was in 1929 when I went to school and I learned Polish. But until then, I could not speak Polish at all. I just spoke German. So the sympathies of middle-class Jews, particularly for the Germans, which the Russians so disliked, were a genuine problem. Many of the defeats which the Russian army suffered during the 1915, 1916 were blamed on Jews, that they allegedly betrayed Russian positions to the Germans, Russian dispositions, army dispositions, and so on. Later on, the Jews were blamed for whatever evil happened in Russia, were blamed on them. I'd like to quote Israel Zankvil, who wrote in 1920 in the Jewish Chronicle in London as follows: "It is a Bolshevik. It is as Bolsheviks that the Jews of South Russia have been massacred by the armies of Petliura, who was a Ukrainian nationalist. Though the armies of Sokolov massacred them as partisans of Petliura. The armies of Makhno as bourgeois capitalists, the armies of Grigoriev as communists, and the armies of Zenikin, the white leader, massacred them at once as Bolsheviks, capitalists, and Ukrainian nationalists." So they couldn't win. When in March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, the provisional government took over. It was a socialist, partly liberal government, and on March 20th, it abolished all restrictions, March 20th, 1917, abolished all restrictions on Jews. They could live wherever they wanted, they could practice whatever professions they wanted, and all of a sudden they became equal citizens. So there was a mass movement of Jews from the west to the east. In 1897, when the first Russian census was held, only 6% of Jews lived outside the Pale. And they were mostly, as I've said, rich merchants or people with higher education. By 1926, the number of Jews living outside what used to be the Pale, of course it didn't exist anymore, were 26%. So the massive movement to the east. Russians now, after the revolution, came for the first time in contact with Jews. In October 1917, as you know, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and imposed a dictatorship on the country. Their plans were worldwide. They were against anti-Semitism, not formally, verbally, but because they were against the bourgeoisie, they also turned out to be against the Jews, because the Jews were, in their eyes, mostly bourgeois. Some of the leaders of the Bolsheviks were Jews, but they denied the connection. A rabbi once came to see Trotsky, who was, of course, a Jew, and asked him to do something about the pogroms. Trotsky said, "I am not a Jew, I'm an internationalist." We now know that Lenin was partly Jewish, that by Nuremberg laws, Lenin would have been considered in Germany, if he had been a German, would have been considered a Jew, because his maternal grandfather was a Jew who converted. So there is something to be said that there were Jews in the party and among the leaders, but as I'll point out later on, they were a small minority. The vast majority of Jews were not pro-Bolsheviks. The general perception, however, was in Russia and abroad that communism was a Jewish affair. And I would like to now quote a longish citation from a book by I.M. Bickerman, Россия и Евреи, Russians and Jews, published in Berlin in 1924. Previously, Russians have never seen a Jew in position of authority, neither as governor, nor as policeman, nor even as postal employee. Even then, there had been Jews, of course, better times and worse times. But the Russian people had lived, worked, and disposed of the fruits of their labor. The Russian nation grew and enriched itself. The Russian name was grand and awe-inspiring. Now, the Jew is on every corner and on all ranks of power. The Russians sees him as head of the ancient capital, Moscow, and in charge of the capital and the Neva, that's Leningrad, and in command of the Red Army, Trotsky, the most perfect mechanism of self-destruction. The Russian now sees the prospect of son Vladimir bear the glorious name of Nachimson, the historically saintly prospect in St. Petersburg, renamed the prospect of Voldarsky, and Pavlovsk becomes Slutsk. The Russian now sees the Jew as judge and executioner. He meets Jews at every step, not communists, but people as helpless as himself, yet issuing orders, working for Soviet authority. And this authority, after all, is everywhere, one cannot escape it. And this authority, had it emerged from the lowest depth of hell, could not be more malevolent or brazen. Is it not surprising that the Russians, comparing the past with the present, concludes that the present authority is Jewish and therefore so diabolical? This was not only true in Russia, this was also true in Europe. I would like to cite some quotations from Western Europe. The Major General Holman, a British general who was head of the British mission to the White Army of Zenikin, told a Jewish delegation that of the 36 Moscow commissars, only Lenin was a Russian, and all the others were Jewish. An American general serving in Russia during the Civil War was convinced that the notorious Chekists, the secret policemen, Lazis and Peters, who happened to be Latvians, were Jews as well. So this was perceived, and this, of course, was a catastrophe for the Jews later on. Sir Eyre Crowe, a senior official in British Foreign Office, responding to Chaim Weizmann's memorandum protesting the pogroms, observed, quote, that what may appear to Mr. Weizmann to be outrageous against Jews may, in the eyes of the Ukrainians, be retaliation against the horrors committed by the Bolsheviks, who are all organized and directed by the Jews, end of quote. Among British statesmen, I think Winston Churchill was the only prominent figure who did not blame communism on the Jews. For some Russian whites, anyone who did not wholeheartedly support the white cause, which was the anti-Bolshevik cause, whether Russian or Western, including President Wilson and Lloyd George, were automatically presumed to be Jews. Henry Ford, of course, as you know, accused the Jews of starting World War I. What, in effect, was the role of Jews in making Russia communist? In November 1917, there were elections to the Constituent Assembly. They were fair and honest elections. The results to these elections indicate that the Bolsheviks, who gained overall in the country almost a quarter of the vote, that the Bolshevik support came not from regions where Jews lived, the old Pale of Settlement, but from the armed forces and the cities of Great Russia, which had hardly any Jews. In the provinces in which the worst pogroms occurred, the pro-Bolshevik vote was minuscule. Now, I'll just mention a few provinces where there were a large proportion of Jews. Volhynia, for example. The Bolsheviks got 4.4% of the vote in Kiev. In Poltava, 4%. 5.6% in Poltava. Only in one city of Yekaterinburg did the Bolsheviks gain 18%, but even that was quite below the average 24%, which the Bolsheviks got in the northern areas. On the whole, the Jewish vote in the Constituent Assembly elections was pro-Zionist. The Jews voted Zionist and not Bolshevik. If they did not vote for the Zionists, they voted for moderate socialists. The census of the Communist Party, conducted in 1922, when they've already been in power for 5 years, showed that only 959 Jews joined the party before 1917. So there was a minuscule number. The notion that communism and Jewry were identical and had very unfortunate consequences because it was picked up, of course, by the Nazis as a justification for the Holocaust. For Hitler, communism was a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. He said Marx and the Marxists were all 100% Jews. And that, of course, was the justification for the Holocaust. The only other region where in World War I in 1917 the Jews played any role whatsoever as communists was in Hungary, where in March 1919, Bela Kun, who was sent by Moscow, took over the government, and he headed the government for a while, introducing Bolshevism, but he fell soon, and in early 1920 went into exile. The events that transpired in Eastern Europe between 1914 and 1917 were a direct prelude to the Holocaust. To right-wing Germans, the Jews were Bolsheviks. To the Bolsheviks, they were pro-German bourgeois. In fact, as I said, the majority of Jews living in Russia were Zionists. But these charges leveled at them provided justification for persecutions that exceeded anything seen since the first century of the Christian era, when the Romans destroyed the temple and scattered the Jews worldwide. And the persecutions were both in Russia and in Germany. And such were the terrible consequences of the events that occurred in 1914, 1917. Thank you. I'll open myself now to questions, which I hope I can answer.
We'll take some questions and answers. Son, do you have any questions?
Hello. I just finished reading a book, The Pope and Mussolini, and those accusations about the Jews being Bolsheviks was before Hitler even, in the Jesuit paper constantly, because they figured they can get pro-fascist people because they were all against Bolshevism. So if they made the Jews the Bolsheviks, they could they could go after the Jews. And that was even before Hitler, starting in the 1920s. And that was the Jesuits. And it's a book, The Pope and the Jews, which I heartily recommend to everybody.
Okay. Well, nothing I can answer to that. Now here, there are questions down here in front.
Yes. Is it true that the...
Just to take it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it true that the White Russians, Yudenich, Denikin, and Wrangel, were responsible for a larger number of murders of Jews than almost anyone since Roman times? Something like 300,000 or 400,000?
The pogroms committed by the White armies... Are you done with your question?
Yeah.
The pogroms done by the White armies were done mostly by the Cossacks, not by the officers of the White armies. The White Army officers were anti-Semitic. They accused the Jews of being pro-Bolshevik and all that. But the pogroms, as far as I know, were mostly carried out by the Cossacks.
But in terms of in total numbers, they were very, very high. I was
They were very
shocked.
high. There were a lot of pogroms, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
As a Polish-born person, I wonder if you have many opinions on Pilsudski.
And what?
Pilsudski, the former prime minister.
Pilsudski. Oh, Pilsudski, yes.
Sorry, I can't pronounce anything in Slavic. Anyway, I read about him, and I had the sense that he was significantly less anti-Semitic than the government that followed him. And I've always wondered, would life have been different for the Jews of Poland, particularly in those years when they were being weakened and starved before the Holocaust, if Pilsudski had lived? And I wonder what your opinion is on his regime and the regime that followed.
You're quite right. And I can speak from personal experience, because I was a schoolboy in Warsaw in the 30s. And until 1935, he died in 35, the situation of the Jews was not so bad. There was anti-Semitism, of course, but it was muted. And the moment he died, the situation began to change. And the last few years before the war were very difficult for Jews. He would not have allowed it. For example, I remember I used to be quite a bookworm. I used to go to the street called Świętokrzyska, where we had many bookstores. And when September came and schoolboys went to buy textbooks, there were attacks on these Jewish stores, run by Jews. Don't buy from Jews, buy from your own people. It would have been impossible. What was really outrageous was that at the university, the Jews were required to sit on the left side of the classroom. I remember as a boy, I was just raging with fury at this. I said, I never go to university in Poland when I grow up. So that's correct. And he was not anti-Semitic, but his successors were.
Thank you.
How accurate is, in your opinion, Solzhenitsyn?
Do you want to give the loud microphone? He has one. Oh, you have one. Okay.
I have one, thank you. How accurate is Solzhenitsyn in his 200 years together? He mentioned Frankel obviously was head of Gulag, but he mentioned that among 19 heads of camps, 17 heads were Jews of Gulag. 17 heads of Gulag camps, heads of them were Jews. Did you check these
Did you hear
numbers?
Can you tell me when?
The question is, how accurate is Solzhenitsyn in his last book, 200 Years of Together, Jews and Russians, when he points out that many of the heads of the Gulag were Jews and so forth?
Well, I reviewed the first volume, and I thought it was very fair, because for the first time, Solzhenitsyn said Jews are not responsible for the Russian Revolution. That there were Jews in the Gulag administration, I don't doubt it. But you know, there were Jews in the fascist party in the 20s. And there were Jews who gave money to Hitler in the 20s. There are Jews everywhere. I don't doubt there were many Jews in the Gulag, but that they were responsible for it, that I don't believe. the Gulag was run by Russians primarily and Ukrainians.
In McMeekin's recent book, The Russian Origins of World War I, it was just published this year, I believe, he states that when the Russian army came into East Prussia, this was before the Battle of Tannenberg, it was very early in the war, the Jews that were living there, many of them landowners, left, and the Russians immediately distributed their lands either to Russian people or to some of the Poles living there to try to gain their favor. I wonder if, I'm not at all sure that that is exactly what happened, but I did read it in the book, and I was wondering, didn't the Jews at the time see that as a portent of things to come if the Russians really took over? Because that was a very strong statement.
I was not very impressed by it.
I didn't say I had been, I just said I had read it in the book, and I'm really checking that with you now.
Yeah. No, I'm suspicious of this information.
Considering the terrible conditions and prejudice that the Jews in the Pale were suffering, why was there not more population migration from the first and second Aliyah into Palestine? And why did some Jews even go back to Russia?
Well, there was considerable migration to the United States, and migration also to Europe. There was migration to Germany, migration to England. Well, there was Palestine even though there were Zionists, as I mentioned, they voted Zionist. Zionism was an ideal, but as a practical proposition to take a family to this desert land populated by Arabs, it wasn't very attractive. So they migrated elsewhere, but not to Palestine. And I can understand it. I mean, what was Palestine? I mean, you're talking before the war or after the war, World War I? Before. Yeah, very difficult. I don't know what the figures are for Jews who migrated to Palestine before 1914, but it must have been very small. I had an uncle who migrated in 1930s, who worked for Weizmann. But the rest of the family, and a large family, nobody thought of migrating to Palestine.
Were conditions for the Jews in Russia beginning to ameliorate in the 1880s before the assassination of the Tsar, particularly in reference to access?
Were the conditions for Jews in the 1880s, particularly before the assassination of the Tsar, beginning to ameliorate?
And I don't think they ameliorated. They became worse after 1881, but they were not particularly better before 1881. It was a stagnant situation, and nobody dared to do very much about it. But after 1881 it became much worse, and that is when the migration began to Europe and to the United States.
What was the source of this obsession by the Polish government, Sanacja, after Piłsudski's death with Jews and the threat the Jews presented? I came by accident to some declassified material in Kościuszko Foundation with a letter of some Polish diplomat to government of United States. It was like hysterical in tone, you know, that do something to save us from those Jews. They are destroying us. They are, you know, the biggest threat. And here, you know, Germany is arming, Soviet Union is very hostile. And this hysteria about the Jews, I was wondering if you can explain if it has something to do with revolution.
At least in part, it was a Nazi influence. The Nazis worked very hard on Polish anti-Semitism because they knew that the soil is good for it. I remember as a schoolboy, it was 37, 38, I got a letter from a German student my age, whom I never knew, telling me how wonderful things were in Germany and how terrible things were in Poland because the Jews were running everything. And they were kindling this all the time in Poland. And there was the fear of the Soviet Union and the feeling that the Soviet Union is run by Jews. But you know, anti-Semitism is a disease and it cannot be rationally explained. It's a form of paranoia. And when you want to ask why you're an anti-Semite, I mean, I had a friend in my school in Poland who was a leading anti-Semite. I won't mention his name. And he used to have discussions with the Jewish students, how terrible the Jews are, and so on and so on. I completely lost touch with him. But sometime in the 50s, I had a call from him. It turns out that he tried to flee to Hungary after the Germans occupied Poland, and he was seized by the Germans and sent to Auschwitz, and spent the whole war in Auschwitz. He came out of the war very pro-Jewish, even wrote a book about the Jews, very favorable and so on. And then there came out this book, I think by Jan Gross, called Neighbors, about the murder of Jews in Jedwabne. And that inflamed him. He's become an arid anti-Semite again. And he now writes anti-Semitic articles on his blog and so on. So I've broken all relations with him. But I say you can't rationally explain it. It's a disease. And I think the Poles were fearing the Jews. The Jews were going to take over Poland with Russian aid, and that'll be the end of Poland. I think.
My mother was born in a small village near Kovna. In 1915, she told me that in 1915, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was the head of the Russian army, ordered all the Jews from Kovna gubernia deported, and she and her family were sent to Nizhny Novgorod. How extensive was this deportation order, and how many Jews actually left Lithuania or maybe other parts of Poland to go to the east?
I didn't get it.
How many Jews were deported?
When?
1915.
Well, there were a lot of Jews deported from the front lines. Yes, several 100,000. Can't give you an exact number, but a large number were deported because they were considered to be friendly to the Germans, which I think they probably were. One of the reasons my family refused to leave Poland, as we did in October 1939, because you remember 1915-16 when the Germans came in and how friendly they were to the Jews in World War I. So there were quite a few deportations. It was in the hundreds of thousands. Jews were deported from the war zone.
What would you know about the efforts of Jan Karski during the war?
Well, Jan Karski was active during World War II, not World War I. Well, he was a wonderful man. I mean, he was the one man who alerted the world to the Holocaust. And I can never forget what he told me. He said he saw Roosevelt and told him what was happening and do something. And he said Roosevelt held his cigarette holder and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Karski, the guilty ones will be punished," and did nothing. So he had Karski, who was a wonderful man, had the saddest face of any human being I've ever seen, because he saw what was happening to fellow human beings.
Hi, thank you. I heard you talk about the fact that many of the Jews were Zionists. What did it mean to be a Zionist in this time period? You said they voted Zionist?
I couldn't understand.
The question is, you spoke about the fact that Jews voted Zionist. What in reality did that mean?
In reality, it meant an aspiration. Someday we would like to all go back to Zion and establish a state, but it's not practical right now. We can't do it right now. But in the future, that's what we want. We don't want to live in Russia and be socialists here or the communists here. We want to be in Zion. But in practice, it didn't mean very much, because as pointed out, very few of them left for Palestine.
I guess I wanted to know, were there Zionist candidates that they voted for?
Oh, there were, yes. The Zionist Party was allowed in Russia at the time, and there were a lot of Zionist candidates. And you could vote for them. And they got the majority of the Jewish vote. Sorry? To what end? Well, it didn't do much good, but but that was their aspiration. The point is that the Jews were not communists. The majority of Jews were not communists. The myth that Jews were communists had disastrous consequences. I mean, that's something that Hitler played on. But in fact, they were not. There was Jewish communists. There were Jews who were communists, but there were not many communists who were Jews. They came to Poland, first of all. No, they came from Germany mostly. They came from Germany into Poland. Then in the second half of the 18th century, Russia conquered Poland and absorbed these Jews. That's where they came from. And there was, of course, the Yiddish is a German dialect. That they spoke German.
Okay, I just want to say that it's to ask these questions to you. It's a machaya. So here's my question.
Is what?
A machaya. This is a machaya. So my great-grandmother was supposed to have said these words, and I think it can't be original. I want to ask you, is this a phrase that was used over and over again? She said in Yiddish, which I cannot speak, "The war has broken the world." This was something she repeated over and over again.
I do not hear it. I don't know it.
Oh, so maybe she was a poet.
Yeah, it could have been a current thing, but I wasn't alive then.
Could I ask you about the role of the Jews in the Cadet Party in the revolutionary period, please?
Could you?
The role of the Jews in the Cadet Party in the
Don't hear it.
the liberal Democratic Party.
Oh, of course there were Jews in the Cadet Party. Jews in the Cadet Party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the Social Democratic Party, but not in the extreme right-wing parties, of course. Cadet Party had Jews, yeah, prominent Jews. Where are our microphones? Could you come down here, please? There are people wanting to ask questions here.
Yeah, the Soviet Union included huge territory, and there were important, really vast differences from place to place within the Soviet Union in a cultural sense, even in language. And I'm wondering whether, particularly in the Baltic area of Russia, attitudes by local people toward Jews at the time that we're talking about differed markedly from attitudes in, say, Ukraine or someplace that was nearer to Moscow or Kiev.
Can you translate?
The attitude toward Jews, what was the difference between Ukraine and the Baltic?
I think Ukraine was more anti-Semitic. Certainly the West Bank Ukraine was more anti-Semitic than say, Lithuania or Latvia. Poland was quite anti-Semitic. Very deeply rooted and very painful. But Russians were not anti-Semitic because they really had no contact with Jews. I mean, a Russian worker, a Russian peasant, Russia was a formerly peasant country, never met a Jew, didn't know what it was. Such Jews as were outside the Pale of Settlement were for the major part academics, journalists, businessmen, and they didn't associate with these people. So you didn't have that kind of anti-Semitism, whereas in Poland or in the Ukraine, there were Jews everywhere in the small towns. So, and they used to outsmart and outwit the local population, so they were hated.
We're going to take just a few more questions.
If the lack of preponderance of Jews in the Bolshevik government was so easy to verify, why did the myth get so widespread that this was a Jewish communist?
Well, because that's the nature of myths.
Yes, but even that it should go, say, to Wilson or.
Well, I cited to you things from Englishmen and Americans who say that everything in Russia is run by Jews.
Yeah.
They didn't study the results of elections to the Constituent Assembly. All they knew, and the quotation here I cited is right, that for the first time you see Jews in position of authority in Russia. They never were there before. Even postmen were not Jewish. All of a sudden, so if you have Jews in these positions, they must be running everything. That's not logical. You cannot dismiss this by logic. Of course they did. The Jews, of course, tried to dismiss it. But once such ideas become embedded, you can't get rid of them.
You said that the majority of Jews voted for a Zionist party in Russia. What was the name of the party and what percentage of the vote did they get in the Constituent Assembly?
Poale Zion is Poale Zion. I don't speak Hebrew, but Poale? Poale Zion, yeah. That was the party. And they got the most votes in the elections, in the only free elections Russia had until then. What about it? Kerensky, what about Kerensky? Well, I said that they abolished all restrictions on Jews, and there were Jews in the government and local government and so on. No question.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions.
In the 30s, after 35 in Poland, did many Jews still hold, despite the news coming out of Germany, did many Jews in Poland still hold to essentially a pro-German, disposition?
It's difficult for me to say, but I can only speak about my own family. My own family, my mother had a large family in Warsaw. And they were not afraid of the Germans. They thought the Germans, are friends, and they were treated us very nicely in 1915 when they came. And we have nothing to be afraid of. Well, maybe a bit of anti-Semitism and so on. But they lived in a world, they didn't really know what goes on in the world very well. The vast majority of Jews lived in their own little world, whether it was business or farming or whatever, and really didn't know what goes on in the world at large. My father, who read a great deal, he read the German press, he read the Swiss press, the Austrian press, the Neue Freie Presse, Austrian paper, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and he had absolutely no illusions. But the rest of our family wasn't really worried, didn't know very much about. I mean, who listened to Hitler's speeches? My father listened to Hitler's speeches. And I remember him running home when Hitler was announcing his speech and listened to this screaming, awful German. But the rest of my family didn't. I assume the rest was true of the rest of the Jewish community, with minor exceptions.
I'm interested in Russian Jews involved in the anti-Bolshevik movement, especially among the liberals, like Bickerman you mentioned. There are a lot of stories about Russian Jewish socialists who immigrated to the United States. And likewise, potentially there should have been several anti-Bolshevik liberal Jews, Russian Jews, who immigrated to the United States. Do you have some personal contact with these liberal anti-Bolshevik Jews?
Do you have personal contact with liberal anti-Bolshevik?
I don't know. Unfortunately, many of my Jewish friends tend to be I won't say they're not pro-Soviet or pro-communist. They're anti-communist. And that is psychologically there's a difference. They don't say the Soviet Union was a wonderful country, Lenin and Stalin were wonderful people. But when you start telling them what really happened there, they think that you're a rabid anti-Soviet man, that you're maybe almost like a Nazi. And that disturbs them. And I've had many arguments. I was accused, as Jonathan mentioned, I've been accused of being a Cold Warrior, this and that. When I worked for Reagan, I was in the White House for 2 years, working for Reagan as a Soviet advisor. People thought that I'm just totally out of bounds, that a scholar cannot do this kind of thing. So yes, unfortunately, that does prevail. They are not pro-communist, but they are anti-communist. That's what I can say from my experience.
Okay, we're going to bring tonight to a close. Thank you so much.
Thank you.